Hello, welcome to Hawkeye Nation. This is HawkCast, your Iowa football, basketball, and recruiting podcast brought to you by Hawkeye Beacon and Rivals.com. I'm your recruiting analyst and host, Eliot Clough at Eliot Clough on Twitter, joined by Dylan Callaghan-Croley of Gophers Nation, Minnesota.rivals.com today. A new father. So congrats to Dylan for the third time in the conversations we've had. So we're going to make this quick so Dylan can go back to being dad. But before we get started, make sure that you subscribe on YouTube, hit that like, drop a comment, subscribe wherever you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify as well. Dylan, first of all, I wanted to chop it up with you before we get started because we've done a few preview podcasts together,
Yep.
talked a little recruiting. Tell me how balancing football and being a new dad has gone.
Yeah, I mean it's a challenge. Thankfully, my wife was home for the first 6 weeks with me and him, but she's now going back to work actually today. So it's now about balancing balancing work and him. But the first 6 weeks it's been a blast. It's kind of like a blur. Uh, they say you don't get a ton of sleep. Thankfully, he's kind of a little bit of a unicorn baby and sleeps through the night for the most part. So that's been great. But yeah, it's been a lot of fun. A challenge definitely to balance everything. But so far so good.
I bet that's killing the wife to have to go back to work too.
Yeah, it definitely rough today. She seemed okay leaving home, but I'm sure it was a long car ride to work.
Well, we're thinking about the Callaghan-Croley family as we're recording here, and of course excited for you and glad that you're
Thanks.
sleeping because man, that seems like the terror of having a new baby.
Yeah, the first couple weeks were a little tough, but the last two or three have been really nice. So I'm just hoping he doesn't have any sleep regression anytime soon, but we'll see. I
Okay,
have to cross my fingers.
right now on to some football. Minnesota and Iowa take on one another this weekend in Minneapolis. Gophers obviously won last year, and we don't have to rehash that, Ohio fans, I promise. But as far as the Gophers are doing this season, back-to-back shutouts, one against an FCS team and one against a Group of Five team. I think it was 48-0 against Rhode Island and
Yeah,
27-0 against
yeah.
Nevada. I guess that was something that the Iowa folks, Kirk Ferentz and some of the players referenced yesterday in media availability. Was they're coming
Hmm.
off two shutouts, so these are good defenses. But to provide a little bit of context, it is lower tier football
Yeah.
teams. Do you think that that's a factor here? Like, do we have to talk about that and include that when we're talking about how the defenses have performed so far?
Yeah, I think I think the defense has performed overall really solid through the first 3 weeks. I mean, even that 1917 loss to North Carolina, they were solid. They allowed only 105 passing yards. They did allow 147 rushing yards, but you look at it, only 3.6 yards per carry, and that was against one of the better running backs in the country in Amari and Hampton. So the defense is definitely improved from a year ago, but yeah, these last 2 weeks, Rhode Island, Nevada, Rhode Island, of course, being an FCS opponent. Nevada, while better than expected, I would say, is still one of the uh, lower tier teams in the group of five right now. They were voted to finish, I think, last in the Mountain West this year. But you can only play who's on your schedule. And the Gophers defense, after a really rough season last year, have bounced back. I mean, rough overall, but especially defensively, have bounced back so far so good this season. But yeah, I take these last 2 weeks with a little bit of a grain of salt. But that being said, back-to-back shutouts is impressive, no matter the opponent.
So I know they had a DB that went to the NFL last year, right?
Yeah, Tyler Newbin, safety, drafted by New York Giants, I think in the second or third round. But yeah, that was one of the biggest losses for them this season on either side of the ball, this offseason on either side of the ball.
Right. I think he was the one that said, yeah, we knew what Iowa was doing on every single offensive snap last year.
Yeah,
Them and the folks in the press box. I'm not kidding. One of my buddies up in the press box called the first three plays of the season last year and the first three plays of the season this year to a T. So, I think things are changing in a positive direction for the Iowa
yeah.
offense. But with that in mind, um, talking about the defensive back in Tyler Newband and their strength defensively, I guess what are the strengths for them? Are there any particular position groups that have really shown to be the strengths of the defense so far?
I would say right now the safety room has been the most impressive group, which was a major question mark coming into the season. The secondary as a whole has been really solid through these first 3 weeks. 105 yards against North Carolina, 117 yards against Rhode Island, 114 yards against Nevada. Again, got to consider the opponent the last 2 weeks, but still impressive nonetheless. But the safety room was a massive question coming into the season. But it's been so far really solid. They have a young kid, Kerry Brown, a redshirt freshman, who's really flashed his last few weeks. 2 interceptions last week against Rhode Island. Um, Coleman Bryson has been solid for them as well. Uh, they have a jack of all trades guy back in that secondary. Jack Henderson plays a little bit of nickel, plays a little safety. He's probably been their best defender this season. Um, he has an interception. Um, but also they've been using him as a blitzer coming off the side there, and he's been really good with that. Has 7 total pressures, I think, through 3 games, 2 sacks, 5 quarterback hurries. So the safety room has been really solid overall. The corners have been pretty good as well. They have a cornerback they brought in from Bucknell this offseason, Ethan Robinson, who was one of the, I believe, top 100 prospects in the Rivals transfer portal rankings. He's only allowed 4 receptions on 10 targets this season. Um, they have Zaquan Bryant, another young guy who's been flashing, and then of course Justin Wally, who's been around the block a few times now, a really strong veteran piece in that secondary who is off to a good start himself. So that I would say that entire secondary this year, after being a struggle last year, has really gone off to a good start. Again, they didn't face, Drake May in week 1 against North Carolina, and Max Johnson got hurt early in that game. And then they faced, 2 lower tier opponents these last 2 weeks. But they've been beyond the surface numbers, really solid on tape. Good coverage throughout those games. Not a lot of guys getting free, where it's, you're looking at more of quarterbacks having missed opportunities. They've just been playing really sound football in that secondary so far this year. And we'll see if that continues this week.
Okay. So for Iowa's offense, I'm sure in doing your prep, you know all about Kaleb Johnson so far
Yeah.
in the country and in rushing. You mentioned Omarion Hampton, who's another one of the top running backs in the country, them holding him in check. I guess one, was that expected going against UNC? And two, how did they do it against one of the top running back? And he's probably an NFL prospect too.
Yeah, they had a really good defensive game plan in that North Carolina game for Hampton. They brought in Corey Heatherman from Rutgers this offseason to be their new defense coordinator after Joe Rossi left for the Michigan State defense coordinator job. And Heatherman has been kind of a breath of fresh air, I'd say, to watch the Minnesota defense there. It's a much more aggressive defense, or at least through 3 games, that's felt like a much more aggressive defense. They're uh, giving a little bit more, not exotic looks, but different looks. It's a nice change of pace from what kind of became a little bit stale defense last season. But they the thing about the North Carolina game was the defensive tackles, I believe, kind of struggled in that game. So a lot of the work was actually done by the secondary, which has been very good against the run this year, but also their main edge rushers and Jaw Joyner. Uh, he's been great against the run this year. And Anthony Smith has been solid as well. He was good in that North Carolina game. So the edge rush, the defensive ends, I should say, have been really good against the run this year, setting the edge, forcing them to go inside on runs a lot. The linebackers have been really good, and like I said, those the safeties have been fantastic against the run this year. Kerry Brown, Coleman Bryson, both playing downhill really fast, high IQ type guys there who really can sniff plays out before they happen on a routine basis. But I think the biggest key for Minnesota this year so far has been just sound tackling, wrapping guys up. They struggled with that last year. They struggled in week 1 against North Carolina with that a little bit, but have since been really good. And I'd also say I think part of that with North Carolina was North Carolina offensive line was definitely did not have their best game. I know they lost a few pieces over the offseason as well. So I think it was a little bit of both sides there going to Minnesota's advantage. But at the end of the day, when you slow a guy down like that, slow down a guy like that, it's still a feather in your cap, to say the least. And looking back on it, I mean, Hampton averaged 4.3 in that game, compared to whatever the number was for North Carolina as a whole, 2.4. So Hampton did have some success, but still, if Minnesota can keep Johnson to 4.3 yards per carry this weekend, I think PJ Fleck and Corey Heatherman would absolutely take that and feel like they probably set themselves up in a good spot for a potential win as well.
So to flip to the passing game, Cade was just like outright bad against Iowa State for the second,
Yeah,
third, and fourth quarters. I think he finished 13 of 29, 99 yards and 2 picks. Flips it to Troy again, context, right? Group
yeah,
of 5
yeah,
team. 19 of 23, no picks, no interceptions. I think he threw like 170 some yards.
right.
So when you're looking at Cade McNamara, we're not talking about elite arm talent. We're not talking about the ability to sling it wherever he wants to, right?
Right.
It's he kind of what he did last week was dink and dunk, and I think that's really what you have to have in Cade McNamara, a guy who just makes the right decision, not trying to
Yeah,
force things.
yeah.
So is Minnesota, with that in mind, are they licking their chops? Or I mean, because this is a completely different game than it was last year with Deacon Hill under center, right? Who could throw the
Right.
ball through a guy's chest. So what's your gauge in on how they handle Cade and that type of attack offensively? Because like Kaleb Johnson's the bell cow, right? Like
Yeah.
you can
Right.
defer to Caleb, then you're going to, because he's statistically the best running back in all of college football right now. So, but I mean, you have to make the defense respect the passing game in order to set up the run game, right? So, and I'm not telling you anything new when I
Yeah.
say that.
Right. Correct. Correct.
But what do you think about the defense and how they'll get after Cade McNamara and like what are your expectations there this Saturday?
Yeah. I think as a whole, the game plan obviously for Minnesota is going to be trying to slow down that run game and forcing Cade McNamara to beat you through the air. And I think Minnesota feels good about their secondary, the way they've played these first few weeks. Now, what is definitely something to watch was Justin Wally left last week's game against Nevada with an injury. It looked like to be some sort of a knee injury. Didn't look to be major based off, uh, how he was acting coming off the field or on the sidelines, but he did not come back into that game. And PJ Fleck is now one to talk about injuries. As he says, there'll be an availability report 2 hours before kickoff, and you'll find out then. So we'll find out about Justin Wally on Saturday and his availability. Um, but I think, Minnesota's going to force Cade to beat him through the air. They're going to try to take away those, short passes as much as they can, or limit, I should say, the yards after catch on those. And I said similar. I just did an Iowa Hawkeyes, players to watch, and I said, Cade is a guy he's not the flashiest quarterback in the country, but he's gonna get the job done for the most part because he's a safe, smart quarterback. You look at the numbers from Pro Football Focus, almost 600 career dropbacks, only 12 turnover worthy passes in his career, at less than 2%. On the other side, though, he's not going to make a lot of, big time game winning throws either. In his career, I can really only think of, I think, one quote unquote big time throw, and that was against Penn State a couple years ago to Eric All. And they credit him now. Big time throws, turnover worthy passes, you could say, is kind of subjective to the viewer. But only 23 big time throws and 600 attempts, 4% of all career passes. He's not going to try to do too much. So he is kind of a hard quarterback to scheme to beat. I think if you're Minnesota, you're just trying to keep keep the Iowa receivers, tight ends, running backs in front of you, not allowing them to get behind you, get an opportunity for those chunk plays. Because I think for both sides here, chunk plays through the air is going to be at a premium. Um, yeah, I think whoever, leads in that category probably has a good chance to win because I think both of these teams are going to focus on stopping these two fantastic running backs, two guys who probably have NFL futures in Johnson and Darius Taylor. So whoever does have the more explosive passing attack in this game, I think is going to be the one who has the best chance of winning. But, you're also going to two quarterbacks who overall don't take many huge risks. Max Brosmer, I'm sure we'll talk about it here in a second, doesn't take a ton of risks. He's a very safe quarterback in his own right. McNamara, as we've talked about. So I think for Cade, it's going to be trying to get pressure on him. Of course, the the Gophers defense as a whole has been solid in getting pressure on quarterbacks so far this season. 45 pressures in 3 games, and 29 hurries in 3 games, 7 sacks. So I think they're gonna try to get pressure. I think they're gonna use Jack Henderson like they did against Nevada, having him come in from the secondary to blitz quite a bit, try to throw some different looks at Cade. But at the end of the day, they're gonna just, I think, try to limit the big passing plays here, keep everything in front of them, uh, and force Cade to make some big throws in order to beat them. So I think that's how they're going to most likely attack this game from a defense perspective. I think we're going to be in for obviously a low scoring affair here, and it may be one that goes pretty fast, depending on how things go.
So you mentioned big plays. That is the Achilles heel of the Iowa offense so far, I would say, is their lack of big plays,
Yeah,
passing wise.
right.
From what I've seen, Cade isn't the same passer he was when he made that Eric All throw, right?
Right. Right.
Those two lower leg surgeries have he'll tell you the opposite, but you can see it in the way he throws, right? Like,
Yeah, I mean, it's just like, a pitcher in baseball. That's where all your power comes from. Let me grab his pinky real quick here. Uh,
okay, okay. I'll talk while you do that. So that's something that I think is taken away from Iowa's ability to throw the long ball. And I think the longest completion so far is to Caden Weegan for 33 yards, something like
yeah,
that. And that was actually Caden Weegan's first catch as a Hawkeye. He's kind of a slot guy. He returns punts and kicks for them. But that's I think the main issue for Iowa's offense as
yeah,
you reference. And if they're able to make those big plays, man, like that's going to help them turn the page.
right.
Um, it's not fixing it overnight by any means with the Iowa offense. This is that's a long road.
Yeah,
So
it's maybe in a few years here.
right, right. Now, you mentioned Max
Yeah,
Brosmer from New Hampshire. I haven't watched a ton of him. I did watch that Minnesota UNC game.
right.
To me, when you watch him play football, uh, he looks like a former FCS quarterback,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Okay. Tell me more about that, because like I said, I've only seen one game.
Yeah, so I mean, Brosmer's been overall, I mean, pretty impressive over these first 3 games. He struggled against North Carolina a bit, but these last 2 weeks he's bounced back really well. He's a smart quarterback. He's not going to throw many turnover, worthy passes, but he's kind of like so far he's kind of like McNamara, not going to throw a lot of big time throws either. He's going to give the defense take what the defense gives him. I'm looking at his passing chart right now. Minnesota, for the most part here this season, has really targeted the short passes. 33 attempts under 10 yards here. They'll go a little bit more into the intermediate, but they're not taking a lot of deep shots. Out of his 94 dropbacks this year, only has 7 attempts of 20 plus yards this season. Only 2 of those have been completed. Minnesota doesn't really have the wide receivers really to make a deep passing game work either. Daniel Jackson's obviously their best guy. They have Elijah Spencer, who's a Charlotte transfer 2 years ago. Didn't have a big season last year. Has had a strong start to this year. He's emerging as number 2 guy. but they really haven't had a deep passing attack in quite a while since, maybe that 2019 Tanner Morgan season with that really talented wide receiver room. But Brosmer, like I said, a safe quarterback. He takes what the defense gives him, and really just focuses on getting the ball out quickly. The Gophers' offensive line has been pretty good in their pass blocking this season. And they like to take advantage of the middle of the field. We'll see how that works against, Iowa's really strong linebacker room. But so far this season, Brosmer was 19 for 22 when targeting the middle of the field on short passes. So I'll be interested to see how they attack this Iowa defense because obviously it's going to be by far the best defense they faced so far this season. And when last time they faced a power forward defense earlier this year against North Carolina, it wasn't an impressive performance by any means. So we'll see how real the offense was the last 2 weeks. It wasn't, I would say, overly impressive offensive performances the last 2 weeks. I still have my questions about this, but if they lose this game, I don't think it's necessarily going to be because of Brosmer, but I'm not sure he's going to be the reason they win the game either, if that makes sense. I think this one is going to rely heavily on Darius Taylor. I think Brosman will have his parts in it if they do win, but I don't see a performance like he's had the last 2 weeks coming this weekend for Max.
You mentioned Darius Taylor a couple times there. I know he had dealt with an injury for a little while there.
Yeah.
Is he back, expected to be 100%?
Yeah, if he's not 100% right now, he's I would not want to see I would not be want to be an opposing defense when he is 100%. But I think he's 100% right now. Had a good game against Rhode Island, over 100 total yards. Came back last weekend against Nevada, 124 rushing yards, average 11.3 yards per carry. He's been fantastic this year. Obviously was fantastic last year when on the field, but that's been the big problem for him so far in his career, is staying on the field. Limited to 6 games last year, really only 5 games because he only saw, I think, a snap or two in their season opener against Nebraska last year. Got off to a strong start after that, but got injured in this Iowa game last year. That missed all the way till the bowl game. Missed the opening game this year, but has played these last 2 weeks. But if he's healthy and ready to go, I think he's going to be a major, major key in this game for both sides. Obviously, for Minnesota, they're going to want to get him going early and often. And for Iowa, if you can shut down Taylor, you're going to have a really good chance of winning this game because I think this is an improved Minnesota passing attack, but I'm not ready to say this is a Minnesota passing attack that can absolutely win a game like this just yet because they haven't done it against a high quality defense like Iowa yet. North Carolina, like I said, they had their struggles against the Tar Heels. Here, let me pull up the game log from that quickly. 165 passing yards in that game, 13 for 22, so not terrible. But if they have a day like that against Iowa, I'm not sure it's going to be enough to get it done if Taylor isn't, able to be productive.
So for Iowa fans, if you're not super familiar with Darius Taylor, I can illustrate something quick. In playing NCAA 25, Darius Taylor entered the portal in one of my seasons, and I immediately sent the house to go get him. So if that illustrates the point of how good Darius Taylor is, then that'll tell you that's an NFL running back.
Yeah, he's I thought when Minnesota signed him, that he was a steal. One of those guys that really, just jumped off the highlight film right away. You knew it was going to be a potential special back. But yeah, I mean, 163 carries in his career, 8 games, 987 yards, 1,200 yards from scrimmage, 9 touchdowns. He's uh, I'm sure he's a fantasy god for people who play fantasy football for college. I'm not one of them, but I'm sure they love him. And yeah, he's gonna be a stud running back for a long time.
All right, we got one question for you, Dylan, and then we'll get you out of here. Uh, I was given a 50.3% chance to win, according to ESPN, favored by 2.5, the total at 35.5. Who wins? What's your final score prediction?
I'm leaning Minnesota in this game right now, but only because it's a home game. I think whoever had the home between these two right now, whoever has home field probably is would be my pick. So in this case, it's Minnesota. I'm not expecting any high scoring game at all. What was the over under you said? Like 36?
30, yeah, 35 and a half.
Yeah, 35 and a half. I can see I'm gonna go probably somewhere in the range of like 20 to 17, something like that. I would be shocked, and I think that's on obviously the high range there. Would be shocked if this is some weird score like 16-13. These are two teams that have quality kickers. Dragan Kesic, defending Big Ten kicker of the year, has been a little shaky this year. Hasn't hit those 50 yarders like he was last year with ease. So that'll be some of the watch here if Minnesota's forced to kick some long field goals, is the fact that he's been a little shaky on those this year. Um, so yeah, I think between these two teams, we're going to be in for an interesting one, fast-paced game here. A lot of running, obviously. So I'm going to go Minnesota. And for a final score, I'm going to go, yeah, let's go 16-13. I think it's going to be a weird one.
Okay. With that in mind, I'm pretty much in the same boat where you are with this game ahead because I mean we have to see it from the Iowa offense and Iowa's defense has allowed some big plays in these last
Right.
few games. I
I,
mean,
I was I was surprised when I saw, they allowed, what was it, 20 points to
21.
Troy, 21 points to Troy. That's not usually what we'd see out of an Iowa defense in the past. These are the games where Iowa, you know, it's never pretty even offensively, but they win, like 35 nothing or whatever. But yeah, I was surprised to see that out of Iowa's defense last week. Um, but Obviously, still, I think a pretty good defense there.
Yeah, yeah, and then special teams too. And the thing that keeps me from any level of panic on that front, and I think should keep fans from any level of panic on that front, is Phil Parker's the best assistant in the country. Like,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
and Iowa has notably recognized their problems and fixed them as the season has gone along. That's just something that Kirk Ferentz teams do. So in this one, the other factor is that Iowa kind of looked at this season as playoff or bust, and they've already lost one game, right? They lost to Iowa State in a game that they should have won. Cade played terrible, um, and the defense allowed a couple big plays. But for that reason, I think, I mean, if you lose this game, Iowa kind of has to pitch the rest of the season, honestly, like at 2 and
yeah,
2. I mean,
yeah. It's and you look at it. Hawkeye's got what, Ohio State coming up right after this. So I mean, two loss. I do think I don't know about this year, but I do think in the future, 9-3 will get some teams into the playoffs some years, depending on the strength of schedule. I'm not sure if it's going to be this year, but yeah, obviously after that Ohio State game, the schedule is manageable for Iowa. But uh, yeah, 2-2, 2-2 after this would be really tough with Ohio State, and then that Nebraska team is looking much improved as well, and that's going to be a really tough game. They're going to be a really tough opponent for everybody this year, I think. So yeah, I would definitely say it's probably a must win basically for Iowa, this early in the season. Minnesota, obviously, if you ask them, I think yeah, want to be a playoff team. I think, the expectations around the fan base is not to be a playoff team this year, but for Minnesota at the same time, uh, well, not necessarily. Well, it is a must win because it is a rivalry game. Everybody wants to, take home Floyd. But for Minnesota, they got Michigan, USC coming up the next 2 weeks. Maryland's not going to be a pushover. And then they got, Illinois, Rutgers, and Penn State towards the tail end of the season. So there's not many, wins on this schedule on paper for Minnesota. And I'm not saying this is absolutely, a win on paper. But these toss-up games, Minnesota's going to have to win if they want to go bowling this year. So it's going to be definitely a big one for both teams this weekend.
all of that in mind, I'm gonna say Iowa scores one more point and say,
One more
well,
point.
I guess I'll flip it. I'll say they win 17-13, where you
All
said
right.
Minnesota wins 16-13. So
All right.
take the under as always with Iowa
Yeah.
football, except for last week.
Yeah.
We hammered
Yeah.
the over last week for Iowa, but as this week goes, hammer that under. Dylan, we appreciate you. You can go ahead and hit end. I gotta wrap up the pod, but you go be
Sounds
dad.
good.
Really appreciate you, Dylan. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks for having me back on. I'll talk soon.
Yep.
Yep.
We'll wrap it up here. We appreciate you tuning into this episode of HawkCast brought to you by Iowa.rivals.com and Hawkeye Beacon. If you're not a premium subscriber yet, you can do that today at Iowa.rivals.com/subscribe. And if you're on YouTube, make sure you hit that subscribe button as well. Drop a like, drop a comment. What is that final score going to be against Minnesota this weekend in Minneapolis, as well as subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, wherever you're listening. Leave that rate and review. It helps us out a lot. And my name is Eliot Clough, at Eliot Clough on Twitter. For now, we will see you next time.